all of you for being here and for taking the time and the effort to think hard about this incredibly difficult problem.
And I start actually by asking Noah if he can share with how he introduced the idea that this issue was important to his congregation in the Valley. How did your congregation come to see homelessness as something important to them?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come. I think it's just really heartening to see so many of our fellow clergy leaders who are interested in this topic and are willing to make a commitment to do something about it. My congregation sits right on Ventura Boulevard, and I'm an observant Jew, which means that I don't drive on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And so I used to live on the other side of the 405 and have to walk about a mile to get to my congregation. And as I did so over the course of several years, I began to befriend a young homeless man who lived underneath the section of where 405 meets Ventura Boulevard. And over the course of time, we got to know each other. And then one hot August day, I was coming back from the synagogue with some food from our fellowship meal that we serve at the end of services, and this gentleman was gone. He had been arrested, and his stuff had been thrown away, which, for those of us who deal and speak with homeless people all the time, you know that that's not an uncommon phenomenon. And so that was in August, and for those of you who know anything about the Jewish faith, in September is our high holiday season, and I was a young rabbi not sure of what to talk about on the season, and it just that sort of called me into action. And so I began trying to explore these ideas, this is a number of years ago now, of how we're going to move our congregation as someone who cares about social justice and has been a community organizer for a decade. How we're going to move a congregation from not knowing about an issue basically writ large to becoming one of the most active congregations in the area over a period of time. And the way that we did it actually was through multiple disciplinary, multiple intelligences kind of approach. So our Super Bowl is the high holidays, so I'm going to be in front of a few thousand people, so I'm going to give a sermon. But before I give the sermon, I'm going to reach out to some of our greatest leaders in our congregation who are going to be in place at the end of my sermon when I say, who's going to heed the call for us to take this up? There's going to be, I had ringers in the congregation already ready to go to say, I will do this, and I had chair people already set up. That's a little organizing, theatrical technique. And then the other piece is that we have this long hallway. If anyone's ever been to the congregation, we have this, it feels like you're in either a Costco or at LAX or something. It's a long hallway, and a friend of mine's an artist who did portraiture of people who are homeless on Venice Beach, named Steve Perlman, and he gave me 35 of his portraits and the bios of everyone who was that he painted for these portraits, and we put them up in the hallway. So even before you got into the sanctuary, you had to pass the faces of 35 individuals who were homeless, and if you slowed down long enough, you got to read their stories. And so the way we did it was to talk about art, the listening, the organizing, all at the same time, and it began to wake up our congregation to this most important issue.
So that waking people up is something that you do a lot, Najuma, and I should say it's Reverend Dr. Najuma, especially through social media and through your radio programs, but also in your ministry. So how are you waking up people to this idea?
Well, I think for us, well, let me back up a little bit. So this is my third church that I'm pastoring. And one of the things about the churches that I've pastored where I am now, homelessness is not new. It's very personal because every church I've pastored, there's either been members that are homeless or there's family members that are homeless. And so the waking up isn't so much the challenge as it is, okay, it's moving people past the point of we're used to it. That's really the challenge was to move our church beyond the normalcy of homelessness within the Black community. And so even hearing Sam's story, while it was heart-wrenching, I can name 10 guys I know just like him. And I can name 20 women just like him. And these are not distant stories. They're very personal, very close. I mean, my sister, for the last 3 years, was homeless. And she, we had to move from shelter to shelter. Thank God, right now she's in Alexandria House. But guess what? My sister has 5 kids. And so these things are very personal. It's not like it's out of touch. So, but because it's so frequent in our community, it was really moving the congregation to let's be more active. And let's be more strategic about what we do. And so we're part of the Days of Compassion, but we also have within our congregation presently days of action that we do throughout the year. We're very strategic about, I have someone in my congregation who has a binder of resources. And so when people come to us, or when we know someone in our congregation, or somebody's cousin's auntie, whatever, we can take them right to a resource. And so it was more about the preaching, the teaching, the days of service that helps my congregation and our community know. I know it seems normal because we can all raise our hand to someone in our family who's presently homeless, or who's been homeless, or who was and is and isn't, and back and forth for a number of different reasons. But this is not okay, it's not normal. And so it's really, for us, it was about moving them past that point and saying, now let's be very active.
And Zach, you have spent the last several years, in particular, working on trying to get a lot of people in congregations and in other communities across Los Angeles to move to a point of action, including working on HHH and H, all of the H's. What has worked to do that? Because it seems like there's either an acceptance of this as normalcy and almost a numbness to break through, or there is a distance that says this is not us, or if it could be us, I'm going to distance myself from that because I don't want to feel as at risk as I potentially am. So how have you done that? How have you contributed to the effort of pushing those two things to help us get to the billions of dollars that are on our plate for HHH?
Yeah. Well, first of all, people at this very table have been part of those partnerships. And I also, just before I start, I want to recognize and appreciate one of our board members, Umar Hakim from the Ilm Foundation, who's here up front. They do amazing work through Humanitarian Day, among other things, so make sure you get at him afterwards about that. What we found was that, I would say a couple different things. We had never prioritized the issue, with the exception of some previous work in Hollywood that happened primarily driven out of Blessed Sacrament Church, which is a Catholic church in Hollywood. And there's a story pre my LA Voice time that is about us working with a community of friends to fight for a yes, we want this in our neighborhood, the Gower Street Villas. And so that's part of the story of LA Voice, but it had never been an organization-wide issue. So it was interesting once we started having conversations with folks about this, and there's lots of the congregations, churches, and synagogues and mosques that are members or partners of LA Voice. They have ministries and amazing work to the homeless. Father Ted's at the back. They have a shelter there. I mean, there's just so much happening. But we had not looked at it as a strategic organizing issue. So I think the first thing was like, why haven't, if I'm the executive director of the organization, why have I not? So I had to ask myself some questions. I think I had to do my own kind of encounter and seeing with the issue, which I could share more about if you want, if we have time. And then I think what I found when I started having conversations, it wasn't that people didn't want to do something or didn't understand the scale or the growth of the problem. It was more like, how will my action make a difference? So, Marshall Gantz, who's a great teacher of organizing, he says a bunch of different things about how you get people moving on something together. And there's a few different, like 2 or 3 that I just want to name. He says you have to move people from inertia to urgency. So the problem itself helped us do that. But you got to talk about it. You got to name it as an urgent problem. That's one of the things the supervisor did amazingly well over and over again in many spaces, and that people in this room did. The other thing was from apathy to anger, or to maybe it's anger for some of us, maybe for others it's just like, this just isn't right, and we don't want to put up with it anymore, which is part of what I hear in your story as well. And then this thing of from self-doubt to you can make a difference. And that's both personal as well as collective. That I can see that, because it's easy when you see a number like 40,000, it's actually kind of our reaction is to say, oh, that's so large, and I'm one person. What can I do? So to actually try to create a plan and some very simple, clear steps for people that made them feel like, and it was true, that if we do these 2 or 3 things, like preach about it, like invite our people to have encounters by participating in the homeless count, like learning about housing first and then actually showing up at a committee hearing and saying, we want to see this housing in our community. These are our neighbors and we want them to live there, and to kind of help package that together for folks. I think that was a large part of it. And I'll add one last thing to this. The other thing was to connect it to the issues we were already working on. So we do a ton of work around building a successful kind of landing home for formerly incarcerated people around policy. Tons of homeless people are formerly incarcerated, either from the jail or prison. We do a lot of work around racial equity and racial injustice. Well, homeless people are disproportionately black, as Najuma just shared. So we also began to weave in the stories and the things that we cared about, and then obviously affordable housing. Most of the increase is people who've been pushed out of housing in the last year. And that's an issue we've been working on for years. So I think it was a combination of those things.
I was struck last night when I was driving with my Uber driver home from work, and he said that he was a member of the Church of God in Christ. And the reason that he liked the Church of God in Christ was because that if he doesn't go for a long time, when he shows up, they welcome him. And I thought that that was so interesting as I was listening to the presentation about housing first, that there were 2 different approaches. One approach was earn your way into the dignity that housing provides, and the other is housing will be the first step. We will get you what you need initially, and then it will unfold from there. And it struck me that actually that's what congregations that are really vibrant are good at doing. They're good at loving first rather than earning your way into dignity.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you can talk about the way in which you use the theological resources of your tradition, because it's easy to talk in abstractions. But when my mom would teach us about what our obligations were, it was because we spent a time in our lives living overseas. And she would say, you need to be kind to the stranger, for you were once a stranger in a strange land. And it was just on repeat in the way that she talked. So what do you actually teach? Get your notes out for sermons?
Sermon seminar.
Yeah. What do you actually
ahead,
preach?
Gina.
There's a few scriptures. Of course, many of you are probably familiar with Jesus talking about, when I was in prison, you wrote to me, and when I was naked, you put clothes on me, and when I was hungry, you fed me. So that's one, right? But here's the term, and I didn't make this up. I have to give credit to my good friend, Pastor Peter Matthews in Ohio. But he talks about making humans human again. And so using that scripture, but also looking at the Jesus narrative and how Jesus, across the board, loved people first. He actually started his ministry, if you go back in the New Testament. He starts his ministry by going into a town, and the first thing that he does is heal everybody. Before he takes up an offering, before church plants. Somebody laughed at that. His first thing, the text says that he went into this town and he healed all kinds of sicknesses and disease. And so really teaching that Jesus model, that our model is to heal first, is to help, is to, kind of bring this uplift. Of course, then there's Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? It doesn't talk about upon me to have a big building with a lot of people, but it's upon me to what? Preach to freedom to the captives and to return sight to the blind. And so some very real human things. And so we use the term making humans human again by looking at that model where the needs of human beings were the first thing that were dealt with before anything else, before doctrine, before policy. And anytime Jesus was approached with issues of doctrine and policy and rules and laws, there was always this rebuttal about how to deal with humanity, about how to deal with the human need. We even see that with the story of the woman who's caught in adultery. And they're arguing with him about law, but he deals with her about her humanity and then says, go and sin no more. And so it's really about teaching our congregation about being human again. And what that really means is caring about people and their basic needs first. Everybody has, and I got this from somebody else, that everybody has the basic need to sleep indoors. And if we can just start there, that's the beginning place for us.
Okay. It's very hard to restrain myself right now. So give a rabbi a microphone. How much time do we have?
No.
Okay, so
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so
It was tough.
no, so okay. Here's I'll give you 3 very quickly. The stories that we read on Rosh Hashanah are the trial of Hagar and Ishmael and the trial of Abraham and Isaac. We read them back to back. Both of those stories have amazing things in common. The most common thing is that you have a parent and a child who are then cast out, who are out in the wilderness and are at the brink of death. And in both cases, an angel shows up and says, I see you. That's our job. So that's sermon number 1. Sermon number 2 is in the book of Deuteronomy, in Parsha Ki Tisa, which is Moses' I have a dream speech for the Jewish people in the Torah. He says, when you've made it, you're supposed to bring this basket of first fruits to the priest. When you have land now, you have a farm, you have a homestead, you have a family, and when you bring this basket up to this mountain to give to God, the priest asks you a simple question. And the priest says, who are you? And then you're supposed to answer, not, I'm Noah Farkas from Encino, California. You answer, my father was a fugitive, wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt and was oppressed. But there we became mighty and numerous, and God brought us out with signs and portents and brought us to this place, flowing with milk and honey. And I have shared my bounty with the Levite, with this orphan, and with the stranger. That's what you're supposed to say at the moment of your greatest success, is that inside your heart, each one of us began as a homeless person. And that a homeless heart is what is supposed to direct us, our North Star, for who we are. And so that even when my folks, or some of them are very successful, and they decide to come to synagogue, they have to know that they began not there. They began somewhere else. It wasn't us who built it up. It was God who built it up for us. And then therefore you have to share your bounty with other people. So those are my 2 sermons.
Zach.
I'll just say, that was great. Yeah, let's clap it up for Rabbi Noah. What's the website?
vbs.org. Come find that.
Which is not Vacation Bible School.
Correct.
Right.
No,
I know,
but
for all you evangelicals out there.
I get amazing deals on swag at Oriental Trading for all the VBS stuff that's out there. It's amazing.
I find the story of the prodigal son, I mean, kind of the blessing I get as being a director of an organization that works with tons of congregations is I get to hear how people talk about it in the Quran. I get to hear how people talk about it in the Torah. I get to hear how people talk about it in the New Testament. So like a lot of things are going through my mind. But I would just say personally for me, and to this theme that you pointed us to, Bree, the prodigal son. I mean, talk about a story of just absolute rejoicing in someone's return to wholeness. And it's not like, well, hold on, tell me you're sorry that you went and blew the money. Hold on a second, like, can you pee in this cup real quick? Or, and the older brother the good brother is mad. He's so mad. And I think that's part of it too, is like to recognize that there's a part of us that is angry, that when we feel like we did it the way, it was supposed to be done, when somebody else didn't, and they get to return to wholeness, we have to just admit that part of our humanity is the part that wanted that person to be punished for what they did. And if we can admit that to ourselves, then perhaps we can find a little space in our heart to behave as the Father did, as our God does, and to say, I am so happy you're home. I'm going to throw the biggest party you've ever seen.
That's good.
So that father and the older brother, that tension between the welcoming and the sort of being doused in love and wanting there to be a consequence, right, for bad choices, that has to exist in the congregational environments that you operate in. When you bring an issue like homelessness, or when you bring an issue of justice, I'm sure there are people who take those 2 polarities.
Right.
And congregations, if nothing else, they teach us the practice of being together, which is the practice of navigating that tension. So how have you done that, especially in an environment that's really polarized and really partisan?
You know me? Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'll say 2 things. Number 1, don't believe what you read on Facebook. Anyone who says that my entire congregation is for something and that look how successful I am, they're not showing you the phone calls, the emails, the meetings they have to go to where these clergy members, myself included and friends of mine, are really being beaten up by their own congregations for taking a stand on immigration, for taking a stand on racial equality, for taking a stand even on homelessness. So sometimes we hide our failures, and if the Torah teaches me anything, it's that our heroes never hide their failures. In fact, their failures is what make them saints to us. So that's the first thing. And then second is the way that I try to navigate it, I guess it's twofold. Number one is choosing the issue. I try to be very careful about it and recognizing that sometimes I'm speaking on behalf of myself and myself only, and sometimes I'm speaking on behalf of what I think our community should be or is doing. So I rub right up against that line all the time, but I do have a line. And then the second one is, and I think what's most important is my door is always open. The answer to an irate congregant who doesn't want this homeless person around them, but also doesn't want to build the supportive housing unit at the end of the block to put them in, is to engage them and not let them walk away, but to have them come into the office where you can have a sensible conversation. And I think and I think you said this so well, Bree, is that I don't know if you said it to me or here or there, but like you said, congregations are really great about practicing of being together, of being an ecclesia, being in Hebrew, being a kehillah, of being a community. But as Americans, we're running away from each other faster than we can pull each other back together. And that the role of faith, I think, is to try to hold these things in tension and to keep people together. So the way I approach it is my door is always open. And if someone gets angry at me, rather than letting them leave, I invite them to sit on my couch and make them a cup of coffee and have a conversation with them, even if we vehemently disagree on policy.
So for the black church, people say, you'll hear people say stuff like, oh, well, all black people this and all black people that. And my pushback is, which black people are you talking about? Because there are different kinds of black people. There are black people that really do care about other black people. And there are black folks that don't care. They just don't. They've made it. They are no longer oppressed. They don't see themselves as oppressed black folks. Their kids have gone to Ivy League schools or, whatever. They live in good neighborhoods. They drive really fancy cars. And so the issues of poor black people are not their issue and not their concern. That's a real tension in our churches. And the challenge is, on Sunday, you could have you could have a mother on a fixed income or a father on fixed income sitting next to someone who has a fancy car or lives well or has a great income, and they'll sit on the pew together, but that's about it. And so part of the challenge when there is pushback, because you do get the pushback, is to take the person who doesn't see themselves and say, no, let's go back, because your history, you're confused about history a little bit. And so there's an educational piece that has to happen. That's how I deal with it when I have those, and I've had a few. We've had quite a few people like, well, because there are black people that think all black folks who are homeless are drug addicts. All black people don't have, and even though we are, as African Americans, black folks, we are heading the homelessness rate, there are a lot of black people that feel like they're all drug addicts. They're all thieves, and they've all been to prison. And so it's a thee and us, even within the black community. And that's a real challenge. It's a real challenge because there's a lot of, self-loathing going on there. And so part of what I've had to do is to do some education and helping people really and you even have to educate black folks on systematic racism and systematic oppression. Because there are some who've made it and they don't feel like there's oppression. They don't know, you're making it up, it's not real. And you have to even go back and educate them and say, no, let me explain it to you. And so it's an educational process. It's a conversation and more conversation and more conversation. And then it's like, well, maybe you should just usher. And, you serve on the usher board and we'll run the homelessness ministry. So some people, you just have to put them in a place where they're comfortable, where it works for them, because you can't make people change their heart or their minds. But it's about education and even awakening, to use your word, waking up folks who don't believe that it's their problem.
Well, it sounds like also it's about challenging the kind of
Yeah.
psychological safety that people
Right.
construct for themselves.
Absolutely.
That say my choices determine my outcome.
Absolutely.
And your choices determine yours.
Yeah, and so
rather than
that mother who's on FDC on the bus stop with her 5 kids, she didn't have to sleep with 5 different men, but you don't know what happened to her or what her life journey was that led to that. So even within the Black community, there's a lot of tension and challenge, and it's that, well, they did this, that's why they're there, so we don't need to help them. But do you know you're related to them? You're connected to them, and so it's a constant conversation and education.
Zach, just briefly.
Briefly, encounter. I think having people encounter other people is like what you were willing to share with us today, Sam. That's an encounter, and we get a chance to encounter you. We get a chance to encounter ourselves as we react to your story. I mean, it happens. Both stuff that's ours and stuff that we've inherited. So I feel like when you did the photos, you're inviting encounter. So whatever ways we can invite encounters that will be disruptive for our own stories about who we are and why others are where they are, we come back to that again and again. And that happens through story, through personal interaction. And I believe we have a responsibility as spiritual and faith leaders to say, who are we not encountering that is in our community? And then from there, see if we can help people build a little bit of a kind of a rational scaffolding for, why it's not the staircase, it's the jump to the top, and then we figure out the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was listening to Sam, when I was listening to you, I thought how remarkable that someone has a faith like this, and I wondered where the church was for you. That there are probably so many people whose faith is actually a result of their encounter with God, but is being damaged by their lack of encounter with a congregation that supports them.
Absolutely.
And so that to me was, where was the church for you while you were having this resilient faith that held you through? I felt a failure. And so I think that's what's really sticking with me for today is where is the church in the midst of that suffering, or where is the mosque, or where is the community, where is the temple, where is the synagogue, the gurdwara, the ashram, where is it? Because people's faith is so resilient that it's allowing them to transcend that experience and maintain it, but perhaps not because of us, but in spite of us.
May the 3 angels who appeared to Abraham as homeless strangers, and whom he received so hospitably, open our hearts to the homeless. For every homeless person is or ought to be an angel to us. May we and our leaders remember what William Blake once wrote, that to turn a homeless person away is to turn an angel from our door. Thank you for coming.